You're listening to the Let's Be Real podcast. Now, here's your host, Andy Hughes.
Our next guest is very inspiring and has facilitated leadership workshops for many huge companies, including SAP. He is a speaker, facilitator, workshop leader, and executive coach. In his career, he has been a CEO of 3 companies and has written 4 books that will change your life. He also founded the highly successful Search Inside Yourself program, which can be found in the learning section on our Success Map portal. We're very excited to welcome Marc Lesser to the Let's Be Real podcast. Marc, thank you for joining us. How are you doing today?
I'm good, Andy. Thanks for having me on.
Absolutely. And I just named all those things that you've accomplished so far. Before we dive into that, the first thing that I'd like to know is, how did your path begin? You've done so many different things with so many different companies. Where did that motivation come from to start working with people on leadership?
Yeah, my path is somewhat unconventional in that I, at a very early age, I was an undergrad at Rutgers on the East Coast, and it was there that I started to get quite passionate about this whole area of human development and self-awareness and humanistic psychology. And I took a 1-year leave of absence and came out to the West Coast. And I happened to wander into the San Francisco Zen Center one day, and I was surprised how much I felt at home in that community, that practice. And it was interesting times. There was a lot of other kind of Ivy League dropouts and a good deal of interest in and sincerity in this kind of meditation practice, mindfulness practice. And that 1-year leave of absence turned into 10 years. But many surprising things happened during that time, particularly around the world of work and around the world of leadership, because I found myself regularly being asked to take on leadership roles within the Zen Center community, which kept surprising me and stretching me. And in particular, my 10th year, I was asked to be the director of a place called Tassajara, which is a kind of a retreat center during the winter, and then in the summer it turns into a conference center with about 70 or 80 overnight guests. Pretty popular place. In fact, I was just recently there, and as director, I realized that I was very much running a small business, and we had a staff of about 60 people, and I was responsible for budget, and and a lot of all the other kind of problems and opportunities of any small kind of conference center business. And I was really struck by, I wondered why everyone wasn't integrating these kind of awareness practices, mindfulness practices with work and with leadership. And I made this kind of decision that would be my path, and that I clearly had just had a lot of training in mindfulness practice and needed more training in the business world. So I ended up going back, finishing my undergraduate degree, and going right into an MBA program at New York University. So that was kind of, and I found myself a few years later, I started a publishing company that ended up kind of growing and become pretty sizable. And then I had this kind of 15-year experience of kind of being in that CEO leadership role with the attempt of walking my talk and running it in a way that felt aligned with my own values. And I have to say, it was hard. I learned a lot of hard lessons in around hiring and firing and raising money and working with investors and a board and the ups and downs of a small business, and trying to do it in a way that felt aligned was I learned a lot.
Yeah, it sounds like it. I mean, it sounds like you've been a lot of different places, and that's a really interesting story. You mentioned leadership, obviously that's one of the big topics that you cover. In your opinion, how would you define leadership?
Well, I can talk about leadership, I think, from a few different vantage points, right? So from one perspective, I think I think you could say that we are all leaders in the sense that leadership is essentially around influence, and we all have influence. We all, especially more and more, need to lead our own lives. In some way, I feel like we all have to be like entrepreneurs in figuring out how to balance our work lives and our family lives and our social lives and our online lives. And so there's a need for that kind of spirit of responsibility and influence. Then there's the kind of the more traditional perspective around leadership is as a role, is that we're maybe we find ourselves we're a manager, we have maybe we have a person or several people reporting to us, or maybe we're in a more conventional, leading a division or leading a company, or so that kind of role leadership. I think the key definition is around kind of inspiring people, helping to empower people, empower, clarify. Um, there's a study that Google did several years ago called Google Oxygen, and they wanted to know what was it that made for an exceptional leader. And what's interesting is that uh, Google, this was a while ago, and their assumption was that leadership and management doesn't matter. So they went in, I think, and I think this is good. This is very kind of a non-biased study, and they came up with kind of three kind of core activities, or things that they noticed that exceptional leaders did. And one, they coached people who they work with. They mentored people who they work with, and and they had exceptional listening skills. So I often think a lot of the work that I do in my own kind of coaching and training and consulting has to do, I think, with helping people to be more active, better listeners. And listening is one of those things that it's easy to dismiss and say, oh yeah, I do that. But no, it's like to really pay attention to when we're not listening, and to pay attention to the quality of our listening, and how much are we actually listening, and how much are we just listening to our own patterns and habits, and not putting those aside and being like truly open and curious to what someone else is all about.
Yeah, that's an interesting concept too, especially with all the distractions we have now with phones and technology. It's probably even twice as more important now to listen.
Yeah, well, I think twice maybe more important, and as I think you're pointing out, more challenging,
Yep.
more challenging to um, the combination of staying focused, really staying with someone, and then to stay with someone kind of beyond what our you know beyond what our own ideas are, being willing to, and I think, boy, especially, it was we're coming off a rough weekend where there's all this news of, and I feel it in my being, in my heart, this weekend of three mass shootings, and
Yeah.
the need to listen to each other on on many levels. And I think in some way, the damage that gets caused, that we cause ourselves and cause others when we tighten and narrow, and when we stop maybe feeling like we're being heard, or that we're really being heard, that we really can understand how to listen and how to connect.
Absolutely. I totally agree with that. Now, I want to go back to something that you mentioned earlier. You had mentioned that we're all leaders in some way. And I thought that was interesting because I was in a workshop a few months ago and they stated the fact that you don't necessarily have to be a manager to be a leader. I feel like some people think a leader has to be a manager of some kind, like a direct, they have to have direct reports. How do you feel about that? I'm assuming that you would say that everybody can be a leader. It doesn't have to be a manager.
Yeah, I mean, I think about in my last role, I was the CEO of the Search Inside Yourself Leadership Institute, and or in my other or any of my leadership roles, but I was thinking that that was one that's fairly recent and alive for me. I wanted each of the people who were part of my team, and in a way, I wanted everyone in the company to see themselves as a leader and a leader. And I think for me, what that means is to not be passive, but in a way to, because you never know where great ideas, where new, whether it's very small, new ways of doing things, new ways of communicating internally, but sometimes, for people to come forward with different ways of serving customers, different programs. So to me, that's kind of exhibiting and modeling a kind of leadership in the sense of, and what might, again, there are many different ways to define and look at leadership, but this is, I think, one of the key ones. This kind of responsibility and putting forth, putting forth what new ideas and being coming forth with that kind of courage that it takes to try some things, to express some new ways of doing things. And so I think in this way, everyone can be a leader.
Absolutely. I agree with that. And I want to get into one of your books, your book, Less. You talk about accomplishing more by doing less. That sounds like a really interesting concept. Could you explain that a little bit more?
Yeah, people often have trouble with that concept. I remember once having lunch with a CEO of a pretty large financial firm who said, "Yeah, I love this book and I totally get it, but I'm not going to let my employees read this. I don't want them doing less." And I said, "No, you totally don't get it. You really don't get it. You should have your employees read this. It's not about slacking off. It's not about working any less with a sense of urgency. In fact, maybe even more." Yeah, so um, I think a lot of what I identify are things to do less of that will help us be more effective. So things like reducing fear, as an example. Uh, and fear is one it's really easy to fall into the habit of, you know, uh, of being afraid, of having this inner dialogue going, which and fear can tighten us. Fear can make us stupid. And if you want to accomplish more, it's like being more and more familiar with our patterns around fear. Avoiding conflict is a really undermining pattern in habit in teams and in corporations, and finding skillful and appropriate ways to get more and more in touch with our own habits and patterns around avoiding conflict, as an example. But there's also, fear, or other things to do less of, less distractions, right? To notice all of our distractions and to have some ability and strategy for reducing those distractions. Less assumptions is another really good thing to do less of, that will make us more effective. So these are just a few examples. But I think a great practice in general for leaders and for everyone is to notice, is to be brave enough, courageous enough to notice what things we're doing that are extra. right? So this is this accomplishing more by doing less. So it's less of the things that get in the way of our being effective, of communicating well. Yeah, thanks for bringing that up. That was my favorite book until my most recent book, The 7 Practices of a Mindful Leader.
Yeah, that's another great one. Definitely all great books. And I like the fact that you talk about, accomplishing more by doing less, because yes, in a way, maybe you're not doing the same task that you're used to doing, but you're kind of passing it along to somebody else that maybe they haven't done that before. And them learning those skills helps out the team in the long run.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, so again, there's that is, I think, one of the great skills of leadership is, it's interesting. It's one of the things that took me a while to learn in my leadership role is how important it is to tune into each person's professional and personal path. And I think, as you were saying, sometimes that means allowing people to and supporting people to learn new skills, to how to be able to stretch people to grow and develop, and part of what that means is to be a skillful mentor, coach, and delegator. It's interesting, this word delegate. People, again, it's easy to be a little cynical about it, but it's actually, for a lot of leaders, it can be really difficult to very skillfully and effectively look for ways to empower people, to grow people, to make clear requests of the people that we work with.
Absolutely. And you've dealt with a lot of technology companies. I'm interested to hear what you think about this. A few months ago, I saw something about the concept of a floodgate versus a gatekeeper, where as a gatekeeper is someone who has talent, but they don't necessarily share the knowledge to make others better. And instead, people kind of depend on that person for their work and certain questions, whereas a floodgate is someone who shares their knowledge by teaching others, and it improves the performances of an entire team or organization. How important is that, especially for a technology company, to keep sharing knowledge and to keep just sharing that across the team so that everybody can access it?
Yeah, super important. But I think it's again, I think it's worthy of noticing and paying attention to what are the roadblocks, what are the things that get in the way, right? So I think most people would have that aspiration to be that floodgate, or to work in an environment where things are really shared. But this is where, one of the things that I've been espousing pretty frequently is this idea that if you're not cultivating trust, you're cultivating cynicism, right? So cynicism and blockages to trust, and blockages to that floodgate of information, that's easy, right? And that's again, it could be politically motivated. It could be because people just aren't communicating well, aren't trusting each other. So again, I think a real important skill of everyone on the team, and of any of the leaders or the leader on the team, is to be paying attention to, what are the blockages to that information, and to be realistic about it, and to not let those things fester. I used to, in fact, this was in a very early piece of writing. I remember writing about a rule that I had with my team, which was, we called it the no festering rule, right? That whenever there was some difficulty, something that, whether I did something, or as soon as you were bothered by something, you didn't just put it aside and say, oh, I'm going to deal with that later. that hurt. I was upset by that, but I don't think I can talk about that. Or and then I've noticed a lot that what happens is these small little things that break trust, or they might seem really minor, but over time they tend to build up and they tend to cause just the kind of the floodgates become little by little they close up,
Mm-hmm.
and you kind of wonder like well, how did we get here? And that's how we got here. There's a beautiful expression, something like, and again, it may seem a little funny because it's a little violent, this expression, but it's a, a tiger goes after a mouse with its full energy. But the meaning of this is don't put aside small things, like, so even things that small small breakages of trust or small little ouches, to put one's full energy behind dealing with those difficulties and conflict.
Very interesting. Yeah, and you talk a lot about mindfulness and self-awareness in a lot of the things, a lot of your discussions that you've had. How important is it to have those in your life to have success?
Well, it's interesting, Andy, how I feel like what we're talking about here, I think it takes a good deal of self-awareness, and I think it takes a mindfulness practice to actually be effective in the kinds of creating the kinds of culture, creating this open culture, this floodgate culture, because it's so easy to tighten, to have some idea about the kind of person I am or the kind of person I want to be, and to avoid or not really notice that that I might be being perceived as different than I want to be perceived. I might be sending a message sometimes that's different than the message that is my intention. And this takes real self-awareness practice and mindfulness practice to be able to even go there, to be able to be curious about such gaps and discrepancies in communication, even to have a good, clear vision of the kind of culture that we want to create, and to have the self-awareness, the presence, the communication skills. Again, to me, all of that, you can call it self-awareness, you can call it mindfulness, but to actually practice these things in the and in the heat of the moment, where there's deadlines and things don't go well, and so these things take real skill and real patience.
Yeah, they definitely do. And I mentioned earlier, you met with so many different technology companies. Do you have a specific story that really stands out to you, that maybe there was a moment that really made an impact to a bunch of people in one of your discussions?
Yeah, I think of a lot. Well, it's funny. Maybe I'll this isn't exactly answering your question, but maybe it is. One of the a story that popped into my mind was, and I've told this a few times, but your audience may not have heard. This was someone who I've worked with quite a bit at Google, and this was a guy who he grew up in Spain, and he had his burning question from a young child was, he wanted to know how the brain works. So he went to medical school and became a doctor, and then was very disappointed to find out that doctors don't know how the brain works. So he then got his PhD in neuroscience. and again, disappointed, find out that neuroscientists don't actually know how the brain works. He then got passionate about storytelling and filmmaking. There was something there. So he then went and got a master's in filmmaking, and Google hired him to be a filmmaker, internally. I thought this was great, right? This MD, PhD neuroscientist is hired by Google. And he was fairly new at Google, and he walked by the auditorium one day and saw a crowd of people, and they were all at a lecture. And he walked in and saw this person giving a lecture and said to himself, there's someone who knows how the brain works. And this on the stage was a Vietnamese Zen teacher named Thich Nhat Hanh. And there was something life-changing that happened to this was my friend Mario. And when I started teaching mindfulness at Google, Mario became at first one of my students. He was in my class. I thought it was kind of funny, someone with all these degrees studying with me. But then little by little, he became a teacher, and he and I were co-teaching together. And one of my favorite Mario stories was he and I were co-teaching a group of doctors, and Mario was presenting this part of the program that said that meditation is just like going to the gym. And it was a slide that showed how little by little you build that muscle in your arm, or you build that muscle in your mind by when you're distracted, you keep letting go of that distracted. And I stood up, and I stood next to Mario, and I said, I agree with everything he's saying, and I want to present that meditation is nothing like going to the gym. And Mario looked at me and the audience, and he smiled, and he said, well, that's why we have two teachers. And we were able together to do this dance of presenting to this group of Google doctors that the different sides of meditation practice. That one side is this, that we do meditate to build that muscle of focus, but there's also a way that that meditation requires kind of letting go of any kind of gaining idea. That it's a bit paradoxical, right? It's like gaining by letting go of gaining, right? If you want to develop your own sense of presence, your own ability to communicate really well, part of the practice is letting it all go. So anyhow, that's came up for me as a tech story with my friend Mario.
That's an awesome story. And I think another thing that I just thought of that we talked about last time that we talked, you mentioned that there's so many companies where people tend to make assumptions, and you brought up in less about making less assumptions. People have ideas, and I feel like sometimes they're a little bit afraid to bring them up to leaders because they just assume that, oh, they're not going to go for this. Do you think that happens quite often in companies today?
Yeah, well, it's interesting. In my 7 practices book, practice number 3 is don't be an expert. And it's a very similar concept. Yeah, I think that, again, this feels like it dovetails with what we were saying a little earlier about, we can, none of us we don't like to be wrong, right? We don't like to be wrong about things. So there needs to be a culture and an environment where it's okay to express doubts. It's okay to challenge each other. I think of there's a model. It's a book from some time ago called The 5 Dysfunctions of a Team by Patrick Lencioni, and he presents a model of team building in which at the bottom of the pyramid of his model is trust, but the next rung up is healthy conflict. And I think what in part what you're talking about is most people don't like conflict. Most people will avoid conflict. Most people will avoid anything that smells of being wrong. So it takes a skillful leader and a healthy environment and a good deal of trust to be able to actually walk one's talk and to create that environment where people sometimes make mistakes. People try things that don't work. People fail, right? I think of my first company was a publishing company in which we were producing greeting cards and calendars and journals. And yeah, if I always just you never knew which product, even if you did a good amount of testing, still you don't know. Or I love how in baseball, a hitter that is successful 1 out of 3 times is the most valuable player.
Yep. Yeah, that's a good comparison there. Absolutely. 300 average is good 3 out of 10 times.
Yeah.
So there you go. Well, before we wrap up here, Marc, this has been outstanding, by the way. Where can people get more information about your work, about your books and everything there? Yeah,
I can be probably more than you'll ever want to know. Can be found at my website is Marc Lesser, MarcLesser.net. And I've actually been posting really regularly these last almost a year now. So there's a lot of information, a lot of videos, a bunch of resources, some guided meditations if that's what people are interested in. So that's where I can be found.
Awesome. Well, Marc, like I said, this was amazing. Really appreciate you taking the time to talk to us.
Thank you. Thanks for your interest. Take care, Andy.